Okay, well, this is a relief map that shows basically the whole Cahokia site as we know it, and with some modern features interposed such as highways, etc. But at the center is Monk's Mound, which is not only the largest mound here at Cahokia, it's the largest prehistoric earthwork in all of the Americas. So in the Western Hemisphere, that's the largest totally earthen mound built by ancient people. It covers over 14 acres at the base. It's 100 feet high. Has several different terraces or levels, and had a huge building on top, probably where the paramount chief would govern from, and then you meet with the council of elders and other visiting dignitaries. So this was sort of the royal palace. Maybe he lived there as well, it's hard to say, but it probably had multiple functions as a public governmental building and religious building as well. To the east of Monk's Mound is the stockade wall, and that was actually built several times, and it ran for almost 2 miles from where you see it here on the model, almost to the museum, went behind the twin mounds, came around this direction, came past this mound. Not exactly sure where it is on this side yet. On the north side, we know at least one of the walls is turning to go behind Monk's Mound, so we assume the others did as well. So this is basically a fortification to protect the central ceremonial precinct, which included Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and about 17 other mounds. It was built, like I said, 4 times over about a 100-year period. First built around 1175 AD. For the next 100 years, it was rebuilt as one wall became old and weak with age and decay. They built a new and stronger one and tear down the old one. It was basically to defend the central precinct. So it shows that warfare and conflict were an important part of the Mississippian culture, especially here in Cahokia. We have no proof it was ever attacked, but the threat of attack was there long enough. They felt the need to keep rebuilding that wall. Out in front of Monk's Mound is the Grand Plaza. It covers about 40 acres and was actually artificially filled and leveled to make it a flat surface where they would have public gatherings, festivals, games, markets, and other kinds of special activities. Probably some of the more important people in their society lived around the edges of the Grand Plaza. There are also other plazas to the east. One here we call the East Plaza, one called the Ramey Plaza, North Plaza. There was another one in here we call the West Plaza, and some smaller ones as well. Over here we have the Woodhenge, which was their sun calendar, basically a circle of posts that was used to observe the rising sun each morning as observed from the center post. The posts around the perimeter, especially on the east side, would mark the rising position of the sun at the summer solstice, spring and fall equinoxes, and the winter solstice. So it had basically a calendar function to tell the time of year and to schedule various ceremonies and rituals, throughout the annual cycle. It was actually built 5 different times at this location. The first one was over in this area. The smallest one was about 240 feet in diameter. It had 24 posts. All the others were built in this general location. The next one had 36 posts. The one we've reconstructed here was the third one with 48 posts. It was 410 feet in diameter. The next one had 60 posts, and the final one was just an arc of posts on the east side. But if it had been a full circle, it would have been 72 posts. So we don't know exactly why, but they're increasing the number of posts each time, and increasing the diameter of the circle as well. Perhaps as they're including more festival dates, or including a larger sacred space to hold ceremonies associated with the calendar cycle. Perhaps as the population was increasing, they needed more room for people to gather out there. To the south of the Grand Plaza are the twin mounds, platform mound and conical mound. And we see these several places throughout the site. There's a smaller pier over here. There are other places where we see platform and conical mounds paired up. And we think in this case, a twin mound, it might be a mortuary complex. We haven't excavated those mounds, but we know from other Mississippian sites that more than likely the building on the flat top mound would be a charnel structure, a place where important people were prepared for burial, perhaps buried later in the conical mound adjacent to it. And to the further south, a small ridgetop mound that you see there is Mound 72. And this is a very unusual mound in that it was oriented differently than the others. As you can see, it sits at an angle, runs from the northwest to the southeast. And also we know from excavations there were 3 smaller mounds under that one. And those in turn covered some burial groups. Ritual burials, human sacrifices, people of high status, and various other types of combinations which will be discussed in the exhibits a little bit later. So these are some of the major site features. Of all these mounds that you see here, about 120 originally over about a 6 square mile area. About 80 of those have survived today. Others have been destroyed by farming activity, housing subdivisions, discount stores, other kinds of modern activity. So very little of the site has escaped some kind of alteration by modern man. Fortunately, the central core is of about 70 mounds is now owned by the state of Illinois and has been protected as part of Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site, which is managed by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Okay, behind me is our entrance mural, and it gives an idea of what sort of downtown Cahokia might look like. We're standing behind what are called the twin mounds here in the foreground. It's a platform mound, and to the left, far left, you can see the conical mound. And we have not excavated those 2 mounds, but we know from work at other sites that this is probably a mortuary complex. That the building on the platform mound here might have been what's we call a charnel structure, where bodies of important people were prepared or saved for burial until the proper time for burial, and perhaps buried in the conical mound adjacent to it. And beyond the twin mounds, we're looking across the Grand Plaza, which covers over 40 acres, and we're showing a chunky field in the middle. It's a game that was often played by the Mississippians and also by later Indians that we know from early documents how this game was played. Usually 2 men would compete on a prepared field. They'd roll this stone disc on its edge down the field and throw spears or lances to where they thought it would stop rolling. And whoever was closest to where it stopped would score points. A lot of wagering was involved. There were village champions, perhaps competitions between communities. So sort of the national sport for the Mississippians. At the north end of the plaza is, of course, Monk's Mound, the largest mound. And in the illustration here, we're showing stairs up the front. We have found evidence where we think stairs have been based on archaeological work that was done. But also on the top, we know there was a huge building over 100 feet long, about 50 feet wide, probably where the paramount chief governed from, perhaps where councils would meet and visiting dignitaries from other communities. And so it was sort of like the royal palace, you might say. And on the first terrace across the front of the left side, there was a small mound that was built, rebuilt several times. I think that first terrace was a late addition to the front of the mound, and perhaps as a result of slumping problems on the other sides, they wanted to reinforce the front of the mound and move some of the activity down to that lower level. So there was probably a small temple on that mound on the corner. And we know it was built at least and rebuilt about 8 or 9 times, but there originally had been some other buildings there which had burned, or probably burned in a ritual, and then the mound was built over them, and building on top of that mound at each building stage. Out in the plaza are a couple mounds. Out in front of Monk's Mound is a ridgetop mound. So there are some excavations there by University of Oklahoma back in the 1990s. And they could see that originally it had been a small platform mound that was later made into a ridgetop mound. The other mound out in the plaza, we know now has another lower terrace facing toward Mounds Mound that would have had a building on top of it too. So most of the mounds here are that type of mound. They're the rectangular flat top mounds that had structures on them, you know, ceremonial buildings, the homes of the leaders, temples, if you want to call them that, or other kinds of public buildings. And around the plaza were other kinds of activities. We can see, in this case, they're kind of showing a market activity. Probably every so many years they might have festivals here at Cahokia. People would come from many surrounding communities to trade and exchange items, and probably have, you know, all kinds of rituals going on as well as the games. So the plaza was sort of the heart of the city. It was probably as important to them as the mounds were. And we know that they artificially built this plaza up as much as 3 feet to level it. Originally this was kind of a ridge and swale topography in this land, so they filled in the low spots, knocked off high spots, brought more soil, sort of a sandier soil in for the surface, and so they're creating this, you know, again, another type of sacred space within their city. Then around the perimeter of the plaza, you see the stockade wall or palisade. This is a defensive wall, again, that ran for almost 2 miles around the central part of the community, and it was built at least 4 times over about a 100-year period between 1175 to 1275 AD. And about every 90 feet along the wall they had bastions that project outward. These would have raised platforms in them where the warriors could stand to shoot arrows out against anybody attacking or catch them in a crossfire between towers. So it shows that warfare and conflict were common during the Mississippian period, but not at the beginning, because when Cahokia first was established, maybe around 1000 to 1050 AD, they did not have a wall. It wasn't until, you know, like I said, around 1175 or so that they started building this wall. And we see a lot of other Mississippian sites being fortified as well. So people lived inside and people lived outside the walled area. There's probably some social difference, but who got to live inside and who lived outside, but we don't know what those differences are at this time. But the city and over 100 mounds were outside the walled district. So there is still a lot of special areas, high status areas outside the walled precinct as well. And at the far left we can see a depiction of the Woodhenge, their circle of posts that was used like a sun calendar to predict the different times of the year by the position of the rising sun as seen from the central observation post. See here is what we call the Birdman tablet. It's sort of the iconic artifact for Cahokia and has been used as our symbol or logo. But it's a sandstone tablet about 4 inches tall. And on the front of it has what we call the Birdman figure. It shows a man wearing a bird-like mask with a beaked nose, like a raptor, holding a wing up to one side with probably a pendant on his chest, and sort of a kilt-like, skirt-like affair underneath. And we think this is symbolic of part of the spiritual realm they believed in. On the back side, it has a crosshatch pattern, which we think represents snake skin. And so we have the creatures or the symbols of the different spiritual worlds. The upper world represented by the bird, the middle world or this world represented by the man, and the backside, the underworld or lower world or beneath world represented by the snake skin. So we don't know how they use this type of stone, but we see samples of these. I'm doing a study currently on tablets, Mississippian tablets. Only a few of them have the graphics on one side, but most of them have the cross-hatching either on one or both sides. So we don't know how they used them, how they displayed them. It's one of those mysteries of Cahokia and the Mississippian world. But we're trying to understand. They don't show patterns of wear. If you're grinding something with them, some people thought, well, maybe they're sharpening bone needles for tattooing, but the lines on these are very uniform and not like the usual abraders that we find for sharpening bone tools. So there's something different going on, but they probably had some practical function as well as a symbolic function.
Mound 72 is one of the few mounds that's had extensive excavations into it at Cahokia, but also one of the most unique mounds because of what they found. What they discovered in this small ridgetop mound that's about 7 feet high, about 140 feet long, is that it sits at a different angle than most of the other mounds. And we think this is associated with the alignment of the winter solstice sunrise and the summer solstice sunset, but also may have lunar alignments as well. We're finding more and more that there are lunar associations with Mississippian sites, and we think at Cahokia as well. Well, in the excavations, they found that there were 3 smaller mounds beneath Mound 72, and that these in turn covered a number of burial groupings. University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee did the excavations from 1967 through 1971 and found that there was a series of events over about 100, maybe up to 150 years of time, maybe starting a little before 1000 AD and up until maybe as 1100 or so. But what they found, they could see that there were, again, smaller mounds underneath that had been capped over by this ridgetop mound. And they could see stains in the ground indicating where large pits had been dug. They could see the profiles of some of the smaller mounds as well. And you see the actual basket loading. They got different colored soils and piled it up to make these primary mounds, that were later covered with the darker soil to make Mound 72. What they found is that the eastern end of the mound, Dr. Melvin Fowler had predicted they might find where a big post had been that was on what he called the center line of Cahokia. And as they dug, they indeed did find where a large post had been, and that's at the far right end of the mound on the map here. And next to that, they found a very elaborate burial ritual, including a blanket of about 20,000 shell beads with a man on top, and now we found that it's a woman underneath at his left side. We used to think it was 2 men in their 40s. Now we know it's a man and a woman, probably in their mid-20s. But the bead blanket or platform on which they're buried has kind of a bird-like shape to it. We think that, again, it's the falcon symbolism that we see so dominant in Mississippian iconography. So in the exhibit here, we're also showing a number of the artifacts that were found adjacent to this burial of a man and a woman, and around them were probably another 10 or more people, some bundle burials, people who have been previously deceased and reburied the bones with them, others who were primary burials buried with them. And this map, we're trying to show them the grouping here, what we call the beaded burial complex, with the man and the woman in blue, people buried again around them. Some, again, bundle burials, some are primary burials. And associated with them, and next to them, were 7 men and women, and piled on top of them are some of the grave offerings, including some of the things we see in the exhibit here. There were 15 of these chunky stones, or game stones. It's unusual to find one, but here we found a grouping of 15 of them, in mostly Cahokia or another type of style of chunky. We found that some burials were carried there on litters. They're made with cedar poles. These were fragments of some of the cedar poles that were found. And we got a date from one of those of around 1050 AD. And there were 2 piles of arrowheads, and it looks like they were actually probably full arrows that were buried, but the wooden shafts have rotted away. But you can see their groupings according to shape or color or style or type of stone. And we see that the chert material came from Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Wisconsin. And these are some of there are more than 750 or so in these two piles. And these are some examples here of the various forms. You can see some of them are more typical of the Cahokia area, and others are more typical of the sort of Caddoan area, Arkansas and Oklahoma. And again, indicating some of the trade contexts and other types of social contexts they had with those areas. To the left are some of the original shell beads that were part of this almost 20,000 shell beads in this particular platform, this bird-shaped platform. And at the eastern end of, the western end of the mound was another offering that had over 36,600 in some of these shell beads, both the disc beads and barrel-shaped beads and other forms, some very small, what we call seed beads, all the way up to some that were maybe a couple inches long. So quite an unusual deposit. And here's some of the mica. There are almost 2 bushels of mica found with a ritual offering. And this is the actual raw material, not the finished product. So we sometimes feel lucky to find one little piece of it. Here we had close to 2 bushels of the raw mica that came from the southern Appalachians. And sometimes these were made into different kinds of beads and ornaments, or they might crush it to make glitter that might be applied to the body for certain ritual activities. So it probably had many, many purposes, but it certainly is not native to this area. And besides what we call the beaded burial complex, we found that there were other mass graves in Mound 72, mostly young women. A reanalysis in recent years by the University of Illinois indicates they range in age from about 12 to 25. And the biggest pit had 53 young women. There may have been a few young men in there as well, laid out in 2 rows and piled 2 deep. Other pits had 19 and 24 and 22 young women, and again, possibly a few young men as well. Another burial, which we see illustrated here, had it was about 6 feet deep, had 2 layers of burials. The bottom layer had 39 people who'd just been tossed in. They weren't carefully laid out. It looked like they'd been lined up along the edge of the pit and clubbed and pushed in. A mixture of male and female, mostly male. And a couple of them had been beheaded. The skulls were down between their knees. Above them were 15 people who'd been carried there on litters or stretchers. Again, cedar poles were forming the framework for some of those litters. And again, mixture of male and female, young and old. So we see differential burial treatment, which suggests obviously different status in life. You're treated differently in life, you're treated differently in death.
There are so many more things that you can see and learn at Cahokia Mounds, and we hope that you visit soon.